I read Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in what I'm calling the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm going to read all of the Cosmere stories and analyze them in a kind of literary fashion. So this is not like a spoiler-free review or some kind of ranking or anything like that. This is literary analysis that I'm going to be doing. So if you don't want that, you're not interested in it, then you should tune out and not listen to the podcast. So this was the first published Cosmere novel by Brandon Sanderson, and it's a story about three protagonists. We have Raoden, who is the heir to the throne of the kingdom that he's in and becomes cursed to be like an undead person and thrown into a kind of ghetto city that used to be a magical place, a kind of utopia, but now it's a cursed place. And then the second character is Serene, who was supposed to be married to him. She's a princess from a neighboring country that was going to form an alliance with Raoden's country via this marriage, but now he has quote unquote died by being afflicted with this curse. And so she is trapped kind of in this kingdom with no prospect of becoming queen or being married to anybody, but she wants to do good and is a kind of political operator, a very savvy, smart woman. And then we have Hrathen, who is something like I think of like a Catholic bishop level rank in his religion, where he is sent to this same kingdom that Raoden is the prince of in order to convert it before a oncoming invasion from his home country / religious capital, where they're basically going to conquer the place and force everybody to convert to their religion in 3 months. And Hrathen's goal is to try and peacefully get the kingdom to convert to avoid basically a genocide. And the book alternates between the three perspectives of the characters. There's a close third-person perspective that's used where we're very much like in the head of the character. Things are being described according to how they see the world. And so there's a little bit of irony there. We should always be kind of interpreting the things that they are thinking and saying according to their particular perspective. So, for example, when Hrathen lands on the kingdom, like he gets off the boat and comes to land, he has a kind of bitter, cynical thought to himself that the place is empty and all of the people should have been gathered there to celebrate the coming of their kind of Messiah, like the person who's going to deliver them from evil and give them to God. That, everybody should have been there to celebrate his arrival because in his mind, he's kind of their savior. And so we can see like that Hrathen has a savior complex, that he thinks of everything in the world through the lens of his religion. And that, he has a contempt for the people of the kingdom while he has like a maybe incorrect amount of esteem for himself. And so it's things like that throughout the story that I think they give a little bit of friction in the experience of reading the book that I find a lot of pleasure in, where you can't take everything fully at face value. I mean, it's not like deeply tricky or anything. There's not any kind of unreliable narrators or anything like that in this story. But the level to which we are inside the head of the characters leaves us feeling as readers, I think, with a really strong idea of who these three people are. I think there are a lot of fundamental themes about the Cosmere that get laid out here in this book, things that Sanderson is going to be coming back to again and again throughout all of the different books and the different series that are involved in the Cosmere. And another thing that he's doing is laying out essentially the type of heroism that exists in the Cosmere, as well as the type of villainy, like what is good and what is evil in this story kind of carries through and gets played with in each subsequent book. But there's something kind of fundamental about this book, I think, that can give you like a really solid understanding of the symbolic way that Sanderson is laying out his story. So, for example, I think one of the biggest themes in the book is an idea that meaning in the world is somehow fundamental and does not rely the perspective of people per se, that there is a fundamental bedrock of meaning out there in the universe to be found by people, and that there are all kinds of different ways to come to it. So specifically what I'm talking about here is the way in which the Elantrian magic system is not working and is causing the people, when they go through the Raoden, where they're transformed from a normal person into an Elantrian, to kind of get into this arrested development phase where they're kind of like in a zombie-like or undead kind of state. The reason that all of that is happening has to do with literally language. That the language of the Elantrians is, for one thing, it's not necessarily alphabetical, it's ideographic. So there's, this kind of magical system, and you see this in lots of fantasy stories, where the way that magic works is by kind of making magical symbols or runes, and the magic somehow flows through that, and then that's, how you do your spell, and the, different arrangement of that whole situation will result in different kind of magical effects. And so in this story, they're called Aeons, and you draw the Aeons in different ways, and it causes different things to happen, whether it's healing or instant teleportation or whatever it is. The problem in the story that Raoden has to figure out is this connection between the ideographic language of the Aeons, and that they actually literally represent something in the world itself, and that there's a direct connection between the language and the land of the kingdom that he's in. Now, while that is kind of a spoiler for the way in which, his plot unfolds and everything, and like the secret of fixing the magic and all of that kind of stuff that he builds up to, why I'm saying that there's a fundamental connection between meaning and language there is that I'm talking about, in the real world, a kind of philosophical way of looking at linguistics of like somebody like Derrida, for example, who you take like any word, right? And we can have a word for something like, say, dog or cat in English. There's a different word for that in French and Spanish and Chinese, Japanese, whatever. They all have different words for the exact same thing. And so the word is kind of arbitrary, but it has a reference to a particular category of thing, or maybe even a particular place or animal or whatever. But everybody has their own word for it, and it's just kind of arbitrary. And so you have this, what you call the word is like the signifier, and then you have the thing that you're talking about actually, that we could all just point at if we don't speak the same language and say like that thing over there. That's the signified. And so the signifier is kind of arbitrary. Like it could be anything. It could be a grunt. It could be, the clapping of hands. It could be a word, whatever. But the signified is the thing in itself. And so that is the thing that it is. And it might not even have a name for it if we've never encountered it or, a thought to had a thought of it before, we wouldn't have a name for it. In this story, that's not the case. Like the Aeons are extremely particular and don't have meaning or efficacy if they are divorced from the thing that they are signifying. So the signifier and the signified are actually one thing. This like directly kind of pushes against a Derridian notion of linguistics. The Aonic language is the land, and the land is the Aonic language. There is no difference between them. This theme echoes throughout the story over and over and over in ways that have nothing to do with language. So again and again, you have characters who are misrepresenting themselves, renaming themselves. So for example, Prince Raoden, when he goes into Elantris, he starts calling himself Spirit or Rao in the Aonic language. And so now he's renamed himself in order to hide who he is, but there is a fundamental person who he is, and arbitrarily changing that name or acting like he's a different person or pretending to be someone else doesn't actually change who he is. Serene does the same thing when she enters into the court of the king. She has to manipulate him and pretend to be a stupid woman when, she's actually a really savvy political operator. She misrepresents herself to Hrathen. And later in the story, when she starts to interact with Raoden in Elantris, he asks her for specific things, like cloth and metal and things like that. And she takes the language of whatever he says and then twists it in a way to technically give him the thing he wants, but goes against what he, kind of the spirit of the thing that he's asking for. In other words, she understands what his words signify, but she chooses not to acknowledge the thing that's being signified and instead just kind of go with a different interpretation of the signifier, because there's a kind of ambiguity that's built into language automatically. But I think the story is kind of pointing to an idea that ambiguity is not something that exists inside of us as a kind of perception, that Serene knows exactly the way that she's messing with Raoden when he asks for, we want this amount of cloth, and then she finds him the ugliest cloth that she can possibly find. We want this weight in metal. And then she gives him that weight in metal in a bunch of worthless, useless, bent nails and things like that. She knows exactly what she's doing when she does that. It's not ambiguous. She's doing it deliberately. She's deliberately misunderstanding what is being signified to her. Hrathen does the same kind of thing constantly. And I think this is where his villainy is situated in the story, that he comes off as very hypocritical, very cynical. He has a view of the world where, it's the trolley problem kind of situation where if you can kill one person and it saves an entire nation, then that's a good bargain. but in the way where, in the trolley problem, you're the person who's pulling the lever to kill the one person. That's kind of Hrathen's thing, is like he's going to be the one pulling the lever. He's not going to be the person jumping out onto the tracks as the one person saving everyone else, at least for most of the story. But he's constantly feeling in himself, oh, the right thing to do would be A, but the smart thing to do would be B, would be this other option. And so he'll do the cynical, the quote unquote smart thing instead of the thing that he feels in his heart is the way that he should be doing it. And it's that tension, the discontinuity between what he feels and what he does that pulls Hrathen to the point where he betrays his religion, because he feels so betrayed by it. He feels so turned inside out as a person by the religion. And ultimately, he's kind of redeemed and sacrifices himself to save everybody. But he's only able to do that once he aligns his actions with this feeling inside of himself of what's really true. In other words, where he's aligning the signifier and the signified in himself. And I think you can see this kind of literally happen to him when, like in his body, when he uses the potion to change himself to become an Elantrian, and kind of like temporarily he goes into Elantris and pretends to be cursed, and then the potion wears off and he claims to be healed by God, when the entire thing is like, we know that he got this potion and what, how it all worked. Not for 1 minute as readers do we think that this is an actual miracle or some kind of like supernatural magical thing happening. We understand the total mundane, cynical move that he's making here. And that's like a misrepresentation of who he is, in terms of like he turned into an Elantrian and now he's a healed person. And then when he does that to Serene, it sends her into Elantris, and a lot of the ways in which she was being two-faced or trying to manipulate Raoden, that discontinuity that I was talking about in the way that she was double dealing with him, all of that kind of drops away and she becomes much more closely aligned inside of herself with the way that she feels about Raoden and the way that she acts towards him and treats him. And their relationship fundamentally changes because of that. And it becomes much like healthier and more aligned, because she's kind of lost a fundamental part of her identity. And as a princess, when she becomes quote unquote an Elantrian. And so over and over and over in the events of the story, I think there's this exploration of a gap between what is signified and the signifier, the behavior and the intention, the knowledge in your conscience and the action that you choose to take. But I think it even goes above and beyond that. It's not just merely in the plot of the story, but I think it's a formal element in how the book is actually written. And I think I've seen a lot of, people say about the book that this is like a bad book. It's not well written, and that, don't start with this one, start with Mistborn, and then come back to Elantris to learn stuff about the Cosmere, because it's just not very well written. And some of the examples that I've seen is stuff about like Serene's story, for example, and the way in which like all the plot twists are really lame and you see them coming a mile away or they don't make sense. Her story is kind of boring and blah, 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 blah. I kind of talked about this in my introduction to the Summer of Cosmere concept, that I don't believe in bad writing or good writing, that is a way in which we kind of disengage from the actual story and we start to project onto the author all of the sudden this kind of like either super competence, when it's good, or this total incompetence when it's bad. And somehow we know what was intended by the author and what wasn't intended. And then we start to judge the book according to that. And what's really happening is that we're having some kind of experience with the story that we don't like, when we say that it's bad, or that we do like when we say that it's good. So in this example with the Serene stuff, okay, let's look at what's going on. So Serene comes into the kingdom of Erelon and she's supposed to get married to Raoden, and then, oh no, he's dead. Well, we already know that Raoden is not dead. He's an Elantrian. And immediately she has this suspicion that maybe he was murdered by somebody, or maybe he's being held captive. And she kind of launches an investigation to try and figure out what happened to him. Well, this is kind of like a boring story element because we already know the answer. And it's not being used in a way where you would typically deploy dramatic irony where the audience knows the answer to a situation. For example, you have like 5 people playing poker at like a round poker table, right? But that we as the audience know that there's a bomb strapped under the table and that none of the players know that, and that it's counting down and there's less than a minute left, right? That adds a lot of tension to the scene because we know something that the characters don't. And if we didn't know about the bomb, it would just be kind of a boring thing of people playing cards. But instead, it's fraught with all this tension because, like, will they find the bomb? What's going to happen? We're not asking ourselves, will Serene find out that Raoden is an Elantrian? Or, is she going to find his killer? No, there is no killer. So the whole thing feels kind of lame and bad because it throws you out of the story. Sanderson is not creating dramatic irony here, I think. And so if you just stop there and you're like, oh, this is bad because of this, you don't start to question, like, why is this in here? Like, the only conclusion that I guess you could come to if you bother to ask that at that point is that Brandon Sanderson is a bad storyteller, or he's dumb or something. Like, he made a mistake, I guess, would be the most charitable thing in that situation. But instead of asking it in that way, I ask myself, why? Why is the story like this, right? And I think it shows the gap between what is being, the information that's being presented and the truth. There's a big gap there, right? And that's that same gap between the signified and the signifier. That's the whole problem in the story, is the way that the Aeon represents the land, but it fails to take into account the chasm that has formed in the land, right? There's all this information over here about Raoden that Serene doesn't have access to. And she's always, throughout her entire story, working with incomplete information over and over and over again that we as the readers already know the answers to all of that incomplete information. It's not about setting up twists in the story successfully, because there are twists in the story and they pull off like very successfully. And I think one of the big twists is that whole thing about the relationship between the Aeons and the land. But this larger theme that I'm talking about that has to do with language and the way in which language is not ambiguous, and that its meaning is directly tied to, there's no gap between the signifier and the signified of the language of Aeon Dor. That's what makes it magical. That's what makes it powerful, is that you write a thing and then that thing happens. And it happens in a very exact way. All of the dysfunction in the story exists where these gaps are present between what is intended and what happens. And so these gaps that exist in Serene's story, I think, illustrate the way in which she's like deeply off target, not in any way that's due to like a personal lack on her part, like an incompetence or something like that, but a way in which can only be experienced through a story where we have multiple perspectives and we have more information than any of the characters do. And so in Hrathen's story, we can see the gap that has to do with his hypocrisy, the gap between how he feels and what he does, his faith and his piety versus his actions and his cynicism. And in Raoden, the gap exists in a way that's like in his body, this pain that is happening to him with the door trying to push through the energy of the magic, trying to push through him. And then eventually figuring out the connection between them, the language and the land, and re-representing it in the Aeons, but not seeing the actual larger connection that's literally between the land and the land itself in the city of Elantris, because the entire city, of course, is an Aeon, and it has to be reconfigured to allow the magic to fully come through and transform the entire community. And so he has to change the land itself in terms of the actual city of Elantris, has to kind of rewrite it, if you will, to correspond to the land at a larger scale in order for the magic to happen. And so that's kind of how the gap operates in his story. And then in Serene's story, we get this kind of weird use of dramatic irony that doesn't work to build tension, but that's kind of, I think, a signal in the story that it's the theme that bridges across the three characters. And as the gap breaks down throughout the story, like they're getting closer and closer, those gaps are getting thinner and thinner until finally they're fully united. Once Serene has all the information that we have as readers, then there's no discontinuity between, who she is and who she wants to be. She becomes the desirable wife by the end of the story that she aspired to be, but also the kind of, political operator who's creating a more ideal kingdom for her people and for the Aerolish people as well. And so it seems to me that like that theme of language and concrete meaning, that there's really something at the bottom of things that if you investigate hard enough in the Cosmere, you will come to answers, like real answers. There are real answers to be found. That's a core principle, I think, of the Cosmere. So enough about that. That's probably the biggest stretch for people in this whole thing. You've probably never heard anything like that from people when they're kind of looking at the book. So let's go to something a little bit more typical or normal and talk about hope. So I think that a lot of Raoden's story has to do with, he doesn't have much of an arc as a character, I think, in terms of like changing his mind about how he sees the world and stuff like that. He's a very polarizing character within his own story in terms of people are kind of drawn to him, is what I mean. That he changes the perspective of other people, and he causes the characters around him to arc towards his perspective of hope and optimism, rather than having to come to a perspective of hope and optimism through a character arc. I think this makes Raoden very archetypal in terms of the hero of the Cosmere. That going forward, we can compare other heroes throughout the Cosmere stories to Raoden, and you can see a way in which Raoden is kind of fundamental in his heroism vis-a-vis the other heroes. And I'll just get more into that as I continue through the stories. But what I mean by that is that the kind of thing that Raoden is bringing to the people of Elantris is a new perspective, a different way to see themselves and to build their community around meaning. And so it reminds me of the work of a guy named Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist during World War II. He was a Jew who was put into a concentration camp and survived that experience, but also counseled people while he was in the concentration camp. And a lot of his work after that went into, trying to help people through that particular trauma. And a thing that he discovered is that reframing the meaning of situations went a long way for people for changing their feelings from depression and anxiety to empowerment and even a potential for happiness, turning dysfunctional things into functional things merely by reframing the way that you look at them. And that's really what Raoden does for the Elantrians. And so they, suffer from this kind of cursed state of always being hungry, of their hurts always being at the peak of their pain. And they, throughout their lifetime, will physically and mentally diminish until they get to the point where they're basically insane and completely atrophied to the point where they, look like a desiccated human body. And all of that seems like really bleak and terrible. And he reframes it as, hey, we're free from the requirements of normal human bodies. We don't need to eat and drink. We don't have heartbeats. There's all kinds of things that we are capable of because of that other people aren't. And that if we choose to see this city as a place where we get to build whatever kind of society we want, instead of a prison and a ghetto where we've been ejected from the communities and families that we valued, then we could kind of accomplish anything. And they start to build a utopia before the magical system is even rectified and they, get all their powers back and everything. And really in a way, the magical system getting fixed at the time that it does in the story is symbolic of the way in which the community deliberately chose to come together under this reframing that Raoden has. And it's like once they decide to be a community together, then boom, that's when the magic fixes and they, the place switches from being cursed to being blessed, from being, non-magical and terrible to being totally magical and powerful. And I'm not saying that, them choosing to be a community in terms of the plot then had a cause and effect relationship to fix the magic. I understand the cause and effect of what was going on in the story. I just mean on a kind of deeper symbolic level. I think that's why the ending hits really satisfying at the end the way that it does, because all of these different elements are being drawn together by the plot and by the magical system. And it's tying together more than just merely the sequence of events, but the ideas and themes that are behind them at the same time. And so in some way, Raoden gives the community hope, but I think it's that sense of reframing that's going to be a really important idea for the heroes of the Cosmere going forward. And I think on an initial reading of the book, probably the first time that I read it, I would have said that Hrathen is the villain of the book, but it's really Dilaf, his kind of lackey, or, the priest that he has under him, who he finds out later was actually like a really high ranking guy, a guy who outranked him in the religion secretly. And again, that's that gap between what is being presented and what is actually true. Dilaf is a really good example of that whole thing. And I don't think that we can read Hrathen successfully in the story as a villain. He has a really heroic arc. He goes from being villainous at the beginning of the story to being the savior at the end. And I think that Sanderson is really playing with us when, at the beginning of his story, like the very first thing that Hrathen thinks is that, hey, I'm the savior of this country. Everybody should be here to cheer me. And then at the end of the story, to have Serene say, he was the savior of this country and we should all celebrate him. Like, that's not an accident, and it's kind of fun to think about it that way and to see the arc, that Hrathen has, as opposed to, Raoden not having an arc in the story, really. But I think that's what signals that Dilaf is the villain of the story. He's the villain to all three of the characters ultimately by the end of the story. And I think that we can see a lot of things in Dilaf that will be archetypal for villains across the Cosmere going forward as well. So he's very situated in his emotions, in his passions, and he's pretty divorced from rational behavior. He's kind of obsessed with revenge against the Elantrians as a group because of his wife dying. The Elantrians failed to heal her, and so he lost his family, and he blames the Elantrians for that. And then his religion kind of radicalized him, and then also gave him magical powers that allowed him to kind of seek to exact his revenge against the Elantrians specifically. And so there's this kind of cynical relationship with religion that's going on with Dilaf. There's a connection to destruction and waste. And for example, he teleports from one place to another. And when the teleportation happens with his magical system, as opposed to the Elantrians, one of the people in the group has to be sacrificed, and they just kind of vanish completely when they teleport from one place to another. And so that kind of destruction, that kind of trolley problem thinking, like I was saying, where you sacrifice one person to achieve your goals, is going to be a hallmark of Cosmere villains going forward, I think. And we can compare a lot of the villains to Dilaf and see a lot of the qualities that are already there. Not that I think that Sanderson was kind of building this story as like, okay, this is like the blueprint per se, but that it's just like a theme, an echoing set of ideas that will resonate throughout a lot of his work. I mean, you could take Dilaf and compare him to other villains in other Sanderson stories, and I think they would have a lot of qualities in common because these are just ideas that Sanderson is interested in. But like I said, since I'm going to be reading all of the Cosmere stories, I really do think that Elantris has a lot of boiled down presentations of heroism and of villainy just built into the story in a nice way where you can understand that the qualities that make Dilaf especially villainous to us are his ruthlessness, his brutality, his chaotic unpredictability that's situated in his emotions and his passions, and just the total way that he misrepresents and manipulates everyone around him. He doesn't seem to have an authentic relationship with any other character in the story. And again, all of the other characters, they kind of, that gap, like I said, kind of narrows as we near the end of the book. And once we know everything about Dilaf and all of the other characters know everything about Dilaf's motivations and, the truth about him being the leader of the monastery and all of that kind of stuff. Once the Signifier and the Signified kind of join together and all the truth is known about everything, that is the point at which he can be defeated. And that is one of the really big themes, I think, in the Cosmere, is that knowledge and learning is the path to victory. That it's all of the studying that Raoden did, all of the investigation that Serene does throughout the story, and all of the internal questioning that Hrathen does lead those characters to the point at the end of the story where they are equipped with everything that they need to triumph. And so the things that the heroes are learning are external to them in the form of like learning from books like Raoden does, learning from society and the people around her, the way that Serene does, the kind of political atmosphere, the political way of learning, socializing. And then there's the internal kind of learning where Hrathen has to learn to realign the way that his instincts and his behavior relate to each other. That he can know the right thing to do and then do that right thing. And that it's really the characters like learning in these different ways is what leads to their victory at the end of the story. And it's not about like, a kind of power fantasy of like, oh, you got the special magical item and now you can blow up the bad guys. It's that Raoden learned all of the different kinds of spells that he needed to learn along the way so that at the end of the story, he could do all the magical spells that would get him the victory. And so it was really the learning that delivered the victory for him and not so much the magic itself per se. And so I think all of these elements, work together to make this a really fun story to read. I always enjoy coming back to Elantris, but they're also going to kind of echo throughout all of the different stories, but they're going to be emphasized and de-emphasized in different ways throughout, in ways that I think are really, really interesting. So I'm excited to talk about the rest of the stories in the Cosmere as I continue to have the Summer of Cosmere. And so next I'll be reading the very short story, if you can even call it a story, of The Hope of Elantris, which is kind of like a little bit of a supplement to this book.